Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to lecture 51 of BMS 300. So today we'll be continuing our discussion on the male reproductive system, and we're going to continue talking about the female, we're going to start with the female reproductive system as well. So whenever we get to a new organ system, I'd like to begin with this overview integration slide so that you can appreciate how what we are going to discuss about integrates with the other topics as well. So you'll notice that we are going to end the semester by talking about how a sperm is going to fertilize an egg, and that will lead to the formation of a zygote, which will eventually develop into an entire human being. And so we are ending the semester with the formation of a single new cell, and we started the semester by talking about what's happening inside a cell. We looked at the major components being water, we talked about the lipid bilayer, we saw the various proteins embedded in the lipid bilayer. So we are going to end the semester by talking about this single cell. And after talking about a cell, we moved on to see how they were connected one to another by the various types of cell junctions, right? And so we see that we talk about a number of cell junctions. Yesterday I talked about the blood testis barrier, which is formed by tight junctions. And you'll notice that the endocrine system and the skeletal system alone has been colored in green because we will get into a little more details on how that relates to the reproductive system. For example, I told you that in the endocrine system, the gonads, namely the testes and ovaries, are major endocrine organs, and we'll see how they will release a number of hormones which will influence the reproductive function. As far as the skeletal system is concerned, I told you how after menopause there can be a drop in estrogen levels, which leads to decreased bone density. So only skeletal and endocrine system we will consider in a little more detail. The other organ systems we really won't consider it, even though they are very much related. So what I'm going to do now is just tell you how these other organ systems are related to the reproductive function, but this is all you will have as a preview for that. And when we consider the various types of tissues, we'll see all four types of tissues: the muscular, nervous, the epithelial and connective tissue we'll encounter in the reproductive system. Moving on to the integumentary system, this plays a very important role in the sexual arousal. I told you there are a number of receptors found in the integumentary system which play a huge role in sexual arousal. Interesting fact, what I'll point out later on in today's lecture, is that even the breasts are part of the integumentary system, and they do play a role in nourishment of the infant after birth, but it also plays an important role in sexual arousal. Moving on to the nervous system, we talked about the autonomic nervous system having two divisions, the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division. So during sexual arousal, it is the activation of the parasympathetic division which plays a very important role, but the climax and orgasm, that's going to be mediated by the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Moving on to the cardiovascular system, this will pump blood to various parts of the body. The penis will be engorged with blood, so will the clitoris as well, and so we see that blood is sent to the necessary parts of the body through the pressure generated by the cardiovascular system. And yes, blood will be carrying the various hormones which regulate the reproductive function. And yes, the muscular system is what makes the sexual intercourse possible, right? And then the respiratory system, we see that during sexual intercourse the rate of respiration increases so that more oxygen can be delivered to the tissues and consequently make the necessary ATP. The digestive system will be providing nutrients for the nourishment of the male and the female gametes. And finally, the urinary system plays a role in males in delivering the semen into the female reproductive tract. So you see how I've colored everything else in gray to tell you how it is relevant to the reproductive function, but we won't be getting into those details. So here is a recap of what we discussed yesterday in terms of the male reproductive system, and I'll tell you what we'll be talking about later on today. So in terms of the male reproductive system, we saw how the testes will produce a number of hormones and sperm as well. Today we'll take a closer look at the hormones which are produced. We also talked about the accessory organs which will prepare the sperm for emission. We talked about the bulbourethral gland, the seminal gland, and also the prostate gland. And we see that the ducts will carry secretions from the accessory glands, and they also carry the sperm as well. And finally, the penis will deliver the semen into the female reproductive tract, and the scrotum, we saw how it maintains the testes from the body at a specific distance in order to maintain the temperature for sperm development. And then finally, we saw how spermatogenesis was brought about both by mitosis and meiosis as well. Right? So this is what we discussed yesterday. Today, we will be continuing our discussion on talking about how the hormonal regulation of the male reproductive function takes place, and we will be walking through this flowchart here. And this is a very important flowchart, as I will illustrate by giving you a sample question. I really hope you're able to draw this out from memory. So with that, we'll move on to the female reproductive system and talk about the various structures, the importance of the ovaries, the uterine tubes, the uterus all the way to the vagina, and also the external genitalia and the mammary glands. And then we are going to zone in on the ovaries to see how oogenesis takes place. Just like how we talked about spermatogenesis, we'll talk about oogenesis, and we'll compare and contrast the differences by again revisiting the topics of mitosis and meiosis, how spermatogenesis versus oogenesis will differ. And all of this discussion will lay the foundation for us to talk about the hormonal regulation of the female reproductive function. This flowchart, so not this this figure here with a couple of graphs. Again, this is something you need to be able to draw from memory, because only if you understand this can you understand how the hormonal contraceptives will work. All right, so this is an overview of what we'll be discussing. So yesterday's lecture, I started with this question: why would taking excess testosterone injections potentially lead to infertility? Right? I asked you this question at the start of class. I never got to it, and now we will start answering this question. So here is a flowchart which I will walk you through, and our story is going to begin at the hypothalamus, and we'll talk about the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis in this figure. And whenever you notice there is a dotted red line with a circle at the end, that indicates inhibition. But if you see a blue line with a pointed arrow, that indicates stimulation. All right, so that is the key to keep in mind. So the hypothalamus will release the gonadotrophin releasing hormone, GnRH. We talked about this in the endocrine system. So GnRH is going to act on the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and it causes the secretion of two hormones. The first one is the luteinizing hormone, and the second is the follicle stimulating hormone. So luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Now both these hormones, they are going to act on the testes, and I will tell you specifically on which cells in the testes these hormones will be impacting. All right, so what you see here is a cross-sectional view of the seminiferous tubule, which I showed you yesterday. And the luteinizing hormone will act on the interstitial endocrine cells, and as the name indicates, these cells will release a specific hormone. They are endocrine cells. They will produce testosterone. Now testosterone has got a number of effects in various parts of the body, right? First, it's going to play a role in maintaining libido. Libido is the other name for term for sex drive. Testosterone can also act on various tissues, and it can increase both muscle growth and bone growth. And this is the reason why when people take testosterone injections, it can lead to enhanced muscle mass. It is because of this reason. Now, why is this dangerous when abused? You'll understand by the end of this slide. You also find that testosterone plays a role in regulating a number of secondary male sex characteristics, such as the deepening of the voice, hair growth in various parts of the body. All of this is possible through the action of testosterone. It also plays a role in maintaining a number of accessory glands as well. Examples of this would include the seminal glands, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral gland, all of which are very important for the reproductive function. And finally, it plays a role in stimulating spermatogenesis. Right? How exactly the testosterone can play a role in stimulating spermatogenesis, we'll have a better appreciation when you consider what the follicle stimulating hormone does. Right? So FSH, this is going to act on a different type of cell. It will act on these nerve cells, which I told you are the really large cells, right, shown here in purple, extending all the way from the basement membrane to the lumen of the seminiferous tubules. So it will act on these cells, and it will lead to the production of androgen binding protein, ABP. Okay, so this protein is going to bind testosterone, and by binding testosterone, yesterday I mentioned how it will increase the concentration of testosterone in the seminiferous tubules by around 20 to 200%, 200-fold, right? That's how much the concentration of testosterone increases because it is bound to this ABP protein. And that's what helps in spermatogenesis, having a high concentration of testosterone. And also it will promote the conversion of spermatids into sperm. So that's the process known as spermiogenesis. Testosterone also helps in the conversion of spermatids into sperm as well. So this is one of the functions of the nerve cells, releasing androgen binding protein. The nerve cells will also produce a hormone called inhibin. And inhibin, as the name indicates, it's going to have a negative feedback effect on the follicle stimulating hormone. It'll have a negative feedback effect on the follicle stimulating hormone. So it's not only inhibin which has this negative feedback effect, but so does testosterone, which is going to have a feedback effect and block the release of GnRH. So gonadotrophin releasing hormone, it's going to be inhibited by testosterone. So the goal is to maintain the testosterone levels, and so when you have an increase in testosterone levels, it will block the release of GnRH. If you don't have GnRH, you will not have luteinizing hormone to act on the interstitial endocrine cells to produce more testosterone, and so testosterone levels are maintained. But when you block GnRH, what else do you block? You also block the release of FSH. And without FSH, you will not have the production of androgen binding proteins, which will bind testosterone and increase its concentration in the testes. Thereby, it can impact spermatogenesis. Right? So when you block GnRH release, it's going to block the release of LH and FSH, and that can in turn lead to infertility. So is this clear why abusing testosterone injections can lead to infertility? Because it's blocking GnRH, FSH, and LH as well. Are there any questions before we can proceed? Again, this is something you need to be able to draw out from memory, right, on a whiteboard. Any questions? Okay, if there are no questions, you all know the drill. I have a question for you. All right, so this is the question I started yesterday's lecture with. Exogenous administration of excessive testosterone can eventually lead to male infertility by decreasing the levels of GnRH, FSH, LH. Do you think all of the above could be decreased, or is it none of the above are decreased? You can turn to your neighbors or your helpful TAs and they'll guide you. Okay, we have over 50 responses. That's pretty good on a Friday, I think. All right, let's see. Arave, anyone in your group has a response for us? All of the above. Right, so most of you said all of the above, and that is correct. I'm glad no one said none of the above, because all of the above is the right answer. Right, so we see that when you have high levels of testosterone, of course, in an unregulated manner, it's going to block the GnRH level, which in turn will decrease the levels of FSH and LH as well. All right, so with that, we conclude our discussion on the male reproductive system, and we move on to the female reproductive system. So I told you that the various parts of the reproductive system can be divided into 4 groups. You have the gonads, which produce the gametes and also the hormones, and also you have the ducts, which are going to receive the gametes and help in its transport, and you have the accessory glands, which will secrete fluids into the ducts, and finally the external genitalia as well. So I told you how all the parts of the male reproductive system will fall under one of these categories, but in the female reproductive system there are a couple of organs which will not fall in this category, right? So that's a heads up I need to give you. So the gonads in the female reproductive system are the ovaries. They're going to produce the oocytes, which are the female gametes, and it will produce a number of hormones as well. And then the oocytes will be moved through the fallopian tube. This is also called the uterine tube or the oviduct. You can use any of these 3 names. This will carry the oocytes all the way down to the uterus. And so the uterus is part of the female reproductive tract. When you think about its embryonic origin, it's developing from a structure which looks like a tube, but still it's not considered a duct. It's considered the female reproductive tract. The uterus is going to enclose and support the developing embryo, and the inferior part of the uterus leads to the structure called the cervix, right? So everybody touch your nose. Okay. So when a woman is not pregnant, that is the consistency of the cervix, right? It's pretty tough. Now touch your lips, right? So right before birth, that's how soft the cervix will become, right, to facilitate the delivery. All right. So we see that the cervix is going to lead to the vagina, and this is also a part of the reproductive tract. This will connect the uterus to the external environment, and we'll talk about the function of each of these parts as well. Notice that anterior or in front of the vagina you have the clitoris. This is analogous to the penis in males, right? It has the same embryonic origin, and then you have these 2 types of folds. You have the labium minus or the labium minora. That is, the minora means the plural, minus is just referring to one of them, and then that leads to the labium majus. The plural term is labium minora. So these are the various parts of the female reproductive system, and we will talk about the role of the ovaries later on in the lecture, but first I want to talk about the other structures. So when you take a look at the uterine or the fallopian tubes, a cross-sectional view will reveal that there are a number of cells seen here, but mostly you find ciliated columnar epithelial cells, right? So if you look at this picture here on the right hand side, this is an electron micrographic image with a lot of the ciliated cells which are seen. Now among this you also have some mucin secreting cells shown here. So these are the mucin secreting cells shown alongside, and there is a 3rd type of cell called a PEG cell, which is not really visible from the superficial view. So if you look at this cross-sectional cartoon of the cross-sectional view, you see these PEG cells are quite deep. Right, so the question is, why am I pointing out these PEG cells? The PEG cells, they are going to release certain fluids which will complete the capacitation of the sperm. So to remind you of what we discussed yesterday, I told you that the sperm which is produced by in the seminiferous tubules, it cannot fertilize the egg. There are 2 steps which need to happen to it, right? The first one is the tail needs to get motile. That happens when the sperm encounters the fluids from the seminal glands, so it activates the tail to start moving, and this fluids from the PEG cells, they are going to affect the head of the sperm, and it causes some structural changes in the proteins, and we'll talk about what those changes are when we get to fertilization. But I told you that the second step in capacitation happens in the female reproductive tract, and it's because of the secretions by the PEG cells that the sperm will actually be finally capacitated. All right, and so also these ciliary movements because of this ciliated columnar epithelial cells, that along with the peristaltic contractions of the smooth muscles in the uterine tube, it will help in moving the oocytes all the way to the uterus. And it is in this uterine tube where fertilization will eventually take place, and the environment in this uterine tube is going to be pretty nutrient rich for the survival of the oocyte. Okay, so this fallopian tube is where fertilization takes place, and it's got these key cells which permits capacitation to be completed for the sperm. Are there any questions, folks, on the uterine tubes? Okay, this is pretty straightforward. Now we move down to the uterus, and so this uterus is a muscular organ, right? And before pregnancy, it's kind of this small, right? It's really tiny, but then during the end of the pregnancy, it's really stretched out a lot, right? And we'll talk about that when we get to pregnancy and parturition as well. So this uterus is a muscular organ. It's going to protect and nourish the embryo and help it eventually to form into a baby. So for the first 8 weeks, it's called an embryo, but then after week 9 onwards, the term used is fetus, which just means offspring in Latin. Now the inferior part of the uterus is the cervix, and this will extend into the vagina slightly as shown here, right? But now we're going to take a cross-sectional view of the uterus to see what are the various layers observed. So this cross-sectional view reveals that there are 3 distinct layers. The endometrium is the innermost lining of the uterine wall, and this is said to be a thin glandular and vascular layer. So glandular means it's able to release a number of secretions. Vascular is referring to the point that it's got a lot of blood vessels which bring nutrients to this layer and carry away waste as well. And this is necessary to maintain the demands of the fetus as it is developing. And this endometrium is going to be very sensitive to hormonal changes, and it is this layer which is going to change during the menstrual cycle, as we will be later on considering, right? So this layer is the one which is impacted during the menstrual cycle. Now surrounding this, you have a muscular layer called the myometrium, and this layer has got the muscles arranged in various orientations. So you have smooth muscles which are arranged in a longitudinal manner, in a circular manner, or in an oblique manner. And the reason why these muscles are arranged in the various directions is to exert pressure from all directions to help in delivering the baby, right? That's why you have these muscles which are found in arranged in a number of directions. And we find that these contractions will also help to expel the menstrual flow at the end of the menstrual cycle. So these muscle contractions is what women will experience as cramps during menstruation. And then we see the most superficial layer is called the perimetrium. We really won't talk about this much, but this is going to be continuous with the peritoneal lining. This is just the lining of the abdominopelvic cavity. This is the peritoneum, right? So there are 3 distinct layers. So now we move from the uterus down to the vagina, and we see that this is a highly distensible muscular tube, and it's going to extend all the way between the cervix right here and the vestibule, which is leading to the external environment. And this is the passageway through which menstrual fluids are removed, the vaginal canal, and also this is what receives the penis during sexual intercourse, and it forms the inferior portion of the birth canal. Now when we consider the vagina, we see that on either side of the vestibule you have these glands called as the greater vestibular glands, right? So these are the only accessory glands which we consider in the female reproductive tract, and these glands, they are similar to the bulbourethral glands in the males, they'll provide an alkaline mucus during sexual arousal, right? So these are the only glands which we'll be considering. In males, the analogous glands to this are the bulbourethral glands, which will lubricate the tip of the penis. Right. So with that, we move on from the vagina to the external genitalia, and there are three distinct things I want to point out to you. The first one is the clitoris. So this is this small projection which is seen anterior to the vaginal opening, and the reason I point out the clitoris is because when we talk about sex determination, we will see what happens if you have abnormally high levels of androgens being produced. What will happen to the clitoris? And so to highlight that, I'm mentioning it now. Right, and then you have the labium minora, which is smaller folds of skin. This is hairless skin, and this will eventually lead to the labium majora, which has got prominent folds of skin with coarse hair on it. Right, so these are the various parts of the external genitalia. So now we move on to the mammary glands. Right, so the mammary glands, one of the interesting things about this is, as I mentioned at the start of the lecture, this is part of the integumentary system. Right, this is not part of the reproductive system, it's part of the integumentary system, and it does play a role in producing milk to nourish the infant after birth. So a closer look at these glands reveals that there are a number of lobes shown here, and each of these lobes, they are separated by connective tissue, which is connected to the underlying layer of muscle. So the pectoralis muscle, to that these connective tissue will be linking it. And each of these lobes, we notice that they're going to have a number of lobules, which will eventually lead to what is known as these mammary ducts, and eventually it's going to form these lactiferous ducts, which are small swellings, and all of them will join together below the nipple. Right, you have all of these lactiferous ducts will join together to form a lactiferous sinus below the nipple, and it is through the nipple that milk is going to be expressed. And surrounding the nipple, there is this darker region known as the areola, and the areola, as pregnancy progresses, it's going to get darker, and the reason for that, I mentioned it a long time ago in the endocrine system. I told you about the melanocyte stimulating hormone that can cause the areola to darken. Why is that important? Because the infant can't really see clearly, so all the infant can see is color contrast, and so by having a darker areola against a lighter breast, it will lead to the infant easily latching on for nursing. Right? So that is the reason why the areola will get darker with time. So with that, we've talked about all of the parts of the female reproductive system with the exception of the ovaries. Right? So in the ovaries, we have these structures called ovarian follicles, and it is within the ovarian follicles where the oocytes are going to be found. And these ovarian follicles, they are going to develop. So you have these primordial ovarian follicles which contain the primary oocyte, and the distinguishing feature of this primordial follicle is that it has a layer of simple squamous epithelial cells, and this is going to develop into primary ovarian follicle, and the distinguishing feature is that it has got a layer of simple cuboidal epithelial cells. Notice that this is, the previous one has simple squamous epithelial cells, this has got simple cuboidal epithelial cells. The primary follicle will give rise to a secondary ovarian follicle which has got stratified cuboidal epithelial cells. So I told you that stratified cuboidal epithelial cells are very rare. This is one of the few places where you find multiple layers of cuboidal epithelial cells. And then finally this can give rise to the tertiary follicle. You notice that this tertiary follicle has got this fluid inside it, right? And we find that this tertiary follicle will eventually give rise to the primary oocyte turning into a secondary oocyte, right? And what exactly causes it to form the secondary oocyte, we'll talk about it. But eventually this follicle is going to rupture and release the oocyte, and then this follicle will turn into a structure known as corpus luteum, and this corpus luteum will produce a hormone which will help maintain pregnancy, and eventually it can degrade into a structure called corpus albicans. So these are some key structures you will find in the ovary. What I haven't mentioned here is the timeline in which these various structures are formed, and we will get to that later in today's lecture. But before we talk about this, we need to revisit the topic of mitosis and meiosis before we talk about oogenesis. So we see that this is a slide we discussed in a lot of detail yesterday. I want to quickly recap a couple of things. Mitosis has got fewer steps, and you will have two identical cells being produced with the same amount of genetic material as the parent cell, whereas in meiosis you will have more steps in division. You will have 4 unique daughter cells with half the genetic material. So the question is, why is the genetic material unique? The reason is because in prophase 1 of meiosis 1 you have the crossing over of genetic material between the homologous chromosomes. That's why you have unique cells. Second question, why do you have half the number of genetic material? Because you have more steps in division. That's why it has less genetic material. Again, the analogy I said was, if you take a pie and you divide it more times, then there's less pie, this pie entering you. If you divide it fewer times, then there's more pie entering each person, right? So similarly, more steps in division, there's less genetic material inside. All right, so now let's see how these steps in mitosis and meiosis apply to oogenesis. So at the outset, you'll see that you start with a single oogonium and you end up with a single oocyte, right? Single oogonium, single oocyte. In spermatogenesis, what happened was you started with a single spermatogonium and you ended up with 4 spermatids, which eventually turned into sperm. So the question is, why is that? And I want to give you the high level answer, and then we'll talk about the details involved. So you see that at the mitosis 1, when meiosis 1 takes place, you have prophase where the genetic material is being replicated, and then you have 4 copies of the chromosomes. Okay, at the start of meiosis 1 you have 4 copies of the genetic material. Half of the genetic material will be lost in the first polar body. Half the material is lost in the first polar body, so now you have only 2 copies. And then in meiosis 2, the next half of the genetic material is lost, right? So you have only 1 copy of the genetic material left, and so you end up with a single oocyte. Now that is how, in the process of oogenesis, a single oogonium is giving rise to a single oocyte. Now let's talk about the details involved. So we find that this oogonium is going to undergo mitosis, and it will give rise to a couple of primary oocytes, right? And we see that when this mitosis is taking place is before birth. So when the baby is still developing in utero, that's when this mitosis is taking place before birth, whereas in spermatogenesis the mitosis is taking place after puberty has been reached. So the primary oocyte is going to enter into meiosis 1, right? And this happens around between 3 to 7 months of fetal development. And once it enters meiosis 1, the very first step is prophase 1, where the genetic material is replicating, and at prophase 1 the process is going to halt, right? So the genetic material has been replicated, that's crossing over, and you have the pausing of this prophase 1, and it's going to remain in the paused state all the way until puberty, when FSH, or the follicle stimulating hormone, is going to trigger the ovarian cycle. So it will remain paused until the FSH is going to trigger the ovarian cycle, and then this luteinizing hormone is going to cause meiosis 1 to complete and thereby form the secondary oocyte. So the time the primary oocyte turns into a secondary oocyte is only after the luteinizing hormone comes into play. And notice that there's only 1 secondary oocyte being formed because half of the genetic material is lost in the first polar body, right? The first polar body is getting rid of half the genetic material, and then we find that this secondary oocyte will enter into meiosis 2, and by the time this secondary oocyte is released from the follicle, it's going to be released in the meiosis, in the metaphase 2. Right? That's when it's going to be released. And when meiosis 2 finally completes is only during fertilization. It's the fertilization of the oocyte by the sperm which finally completes meiosis 2. Right? So these are the various steps involved in oogenesis. So to recap the main points, you start with the single primary oocyte. It enters meiosis 1 and it's halted at prophase 1, and then the meiosis 1 will resume at puberty, and luteinizing hormone causes it to complete meiosis 1, and then it's going to be released in meiosis 2 state, specifically metaphase 2, and meiosis 2 is completed during fertilization. Okay. Now we find that before birth, because this mitosis is taking place, you have close to 7 million primary oocytes, right? And by the time birth happens, through a process called atresia, you have a dramatic decline in the number of oocytes. You have 1 to 2 million, and then by the time puberty hits, we see that there's gradual loss in these oocytes, leading to around 500,000 by the time puberty hits, and in adults it's only around 300,000 oocytes. And by the time all of these primordial follicles will eventually atrophy, that's when menopause is going to onset. Right? And we'll talk about menopause when we come back next week. But here are a couple of questions. Are there any questions for me on this slide here? Any questions? Okay, you know the drill. If there are no questions from you, I'll ask a question to make sure that most of you know what I'm talking about. So the female germ cells enter meiosis 1 before birth, during puberty, at fertilization, during menopause. You can turn to your neighbors or your helpful TAs and they'll guide you. When did the female germ cells enter meiosis 1? Okay, all right, folks, let's bring it back together. All right, Leila, do you have anyone in your group who wants to share their thoughts with us? No idea? Choose something. A, before birth. Okay, most of you picked before birth, and that is correct. So we see that it's between the 3 to 7 months of the fetal development when the primary oocytes are going to enter into meiosis 1. So that happens before birth. Here's another question. So the female germ cells, they will complete meiosis 2. Is it, again, the 4 options: before birth, during puberty, at fertilization, or during menopause? You can again turn to your neighbors or your helpful TAs and they'll guide you. So this is a pretty important concept, folks. You can expect a question on this in the final exam. Okay, close to 50 responses are away. Anyone in your group has a response for us? At fertilization. Okay, most of you did pick fertilization, and so it is during fertilization where meiosis II is going to be completed, because during ovulation it's the secondary oocyte is released in metaphase 2, but in order to complete meiosis II it happens only at fertilization. Alright, so now we're going to move on and talk about the regulation of the female reproductive function, and this is going to be a lot more complicated than the regulation of the male reproductive function, because you have changes which are happening at the ovaries, as you can see here. You also have changes happening at the uterine lining as well. So on the left hand side panel we will see what is happening, and on the right hand panel we are going to see when it's happening. I'm going to give you a timeline on how things are going to happen. And also remember that you have the red dotted line indicating inhibition and a blue line with a sharp arrow indicating stimulation. So again, our story starts with the hypothalamus releasing the gonadotrophin releasing hormone, and the GnRH is going to act on the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland to bring about the production and the secretion of the follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, just as seen in males, you have production and secretion of follicle stimulating hormone. However, when it comes to the luteinizing hormone, the luteinizing hormone will be produced because of stimulation of GnRH, but its secretion is going to be mediated by a different hormone. Right? So the luteinizing hormone release will be brought about by a different hormone. So what does follicle stimulating hormone do? As the name indicates, it's going to stimulate the follicles, and where are the follicles found? They are found on the ovaries. Right? We talked about the primordial, primary, secondary, tertiary follicles. Right? It's going to act on the ovaries, lead to follicle development as shown here. Right? So this picture here is showing you how the follicles are developing. And as the follicles develop, we see that the ovaries will also produce the inhibin hormone, which will have a negative feedback effect and block the follicle stimulating hormone. So just as you saw in the male reproductive system as well. Now inside the follicle there are these cells known as granulosa cells. Right? There are these cells called granulosa cells which will produce estrogen. Right? These granulosa cells will produce estrogen. Estrogen has a number of effects. It's going to play a role in the central nervous system to bring about stress response, reward and motivation pathway. Can also play a role in the sexual response as well. So stress, sexual response, reward motivation pathway, all of this can be brought about by estrogen acting on the central nervous system. It can also increase bone and muscle growth, and this is the reason why when you don't have estrogen after menopause, you will see a decrease in bone density, because the osteoclastic activity is increased. That leads to bone resorption and a higher risk of osteoporosis. You also have the female secondary sex characteristics brought about by estrogen. This could be examples like breast development, maybe the development of fat in different parts of the body like the hips. You also have the accessory glands and organs being affected by estrogen. And finally, it can also stimulate the endometrial lining. And so this picture here on the right hand side is showing you how the endometrial lining is developed. That is influenced not only by estrogen but another hormone, but estrogen plays a role in that as well. Now estrogen has another function, and that is regulating the release of the luteinizing hormone. I told you luteinizing hormone production is mediated by GnRH, right? But its release is mediated by estrogen. So until 10 days, estrogen levels are not high enough, and it's going to have an inhibitory effect on the release of luteinizing hormone. I'll repeat, until 10 days after the menstrual cycle has started, estrogen levels aren't high enough, and it's going to have an inhibitory effect on the release of luteinizing hormone. But then it'll start singing a different tune after day 10. Right? So after day 10, the estrogen is going to tell the luteinizing hormone to be released. Right? It's going to tell it to be secreted. And so by day 14, after the start of the menstrual cycle, we find that luteinizing hormone will be released in a high amount. That's called the luteal surge in the luteinizing hormone, and this is going to act on the follicles again. Specifically, it's going to act on this tertiary follicle, cause the primary oocyte to complete meiosis 1 and turn into the secondary oocyte. It will also cause the follicle to rupture and release the oocyte. Right? So the secondary oocyte is being released because the follicle ruptures. What causes that? It's the luteinizing hormone, and it will cause this ruptured follicle to turn into the corpus luteum, this yellow structure here. And corpus luteum, it's going to produce a hormone known as progesterone. So corpus luteum produces progesterone. What is the role of progesterone? Its goal is to maintain the pregnancy. So progesterone also acts on this endometrial lining to stimulate its growth and secretion as well. Progesterone has another function, and that is it's got a negative feedback effect on the gonadotrophin releasing hormone, and it will decrease it. Okay, so this is a quick overview of what happens. Now I'm going to tell you when that happens by walking you through what's happening in the right hand panel. So in the topmost panel, you see that there are hormones produced by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, namely FSH, LH, and also the hypothalamus is producing GnRH. And then in the third panel, we have the ovarian hormones which are secreted, and we'll see what their impact is. And so as we go through this graph on the right hand side, I need you to ask yourself, tell me why, every time, right? And the reason you have to do that is you need to know what is the consequence of this hormone levels going up or going down, right? So we see that the GnRH level is going up, right? As the GnRH level goes up, it's going to cause the secretion of FSH, right? So you have this blue line indicating FSH level goes up. Because FSH level goes up, what happens? The follicles are going to be developed as shown here. The follicles are developing. And not only are the follicles developing, but inside the follicles you have the granulosa cells producing estrogen, and so you have an increase in the estrogen levels. If you increase the estrogen levels, what happens? The endometrial lining is proliferating as well. And then notice that there is a gradual drop in the FSH levels, and again, why is that? It's because of this inhibin level increasing. It's going to inhibit FSH secretion, so FSH levels drops down. And then the estrogen levels are reaching a certain threshold, and that causes the luteinizing hormone to be released. So this pink line here is indicating a surge in the luteinizing hormone that will cause ovulation, where the follicle will rupture and release the oocyte. And then this follicle which has ruptured will turn into the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum will produce progesterone. That's shown here by this black line here, right? The progesterone level goes up, and as the progesterone level goes up, it's going to have a negative feedback effect on the GnRH level. So notice this green line here is starting to flatline, right? Because it's going to inhibit GnRH release. If GnRH is inhibited, so will there be an inhibition of FSH and LH as well. And if pregnancy has not been achieved in this cycle, we see that the corpus luteum is going to degrade. So once the corpus luteum degrades, what happens? The progesterone levels will drop, and once the progesterone levels drop, then GnRH levels can increase again, and that will start an entirely new cycle, right? So that is how the female reproductive function is regulated by hormones secreted at the hypothalamic pituitary axis and at the ovarian level as well. So please practice this multiple times. There will be a question on this. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you all on Monday. Thank you for your time.